Hello, everyone. We're back with How to Fix Democracy, and one of the most prescient viewers of American politics is my guest today, Dana Milbank. He's a prolific Washington Post columnist, and he's the author of a new book, The Destructionists, the 25-year crack-up of the Republican Party. Dana, as we talk in the final quarter of 2022, pessimistic are you about the future of American democracy?
Well, Andrew, I'm very optimistic in the long term. I believe that the problems that we're seeing right now are a backlash against the demographic changes that are occurring in this country, becoming a white minority country. That happens around the year 2045. Eventually demographics will win out. This will become a multicultural majority in this country. Younger generations are very comfortable with that. So this backlash that the Republican Party has been stoking, I argue, of white, mostly men, mostly non-college educated Americans, this will be resolved. So that I'm full of optimism for the long run. Now, until we get to that point, I'm not terribly optimistic because there's not a lot of reasons to suspect that the path that the Republican Party has been on, which is to maximize the turnout, maximize the engagement, indeed maximize the paranoia and rage of this of what is becoming this white minority. They seem to not be turning away from that strategy at all. So I suspect things get worse before they get better. And our job, those who are sort of small d Democrats, is to try to hold on to as many of our democratic institutions as we can for as long as we can against these assaults. But I think it's very much a rearguard action.
Talking about the long term, Dana, I don't want to make any jokes about all of us being dead, but John Maynard Keynes, of course, famously said that in the long run, we're all dead. I have to admit, I'm a little nervous of waiting till 2045. That's the day when, is that the date when white and not white Americans will become equal in America, or is there any particular significance to 2045?
Give or take, but that's when the census has estimated that would happen. And as a matter of the electorate, they would probably take, because of voting patterns, would probably take another decade or two after that. But I'm not at all suggesting waiting for that. I mean, the book I've written is an argument for engagement and for activism. And that's, for all of us. I think journalists need to be partisans, not for Republicans or Democrats, but for democracy and for the truth. The truth is under assault in the United States. Democracy is under assault in the United States. And those who care about either of those things, which should be all of us, need to be out there working towards that. And I mean, voting is the very floor. That's the very the very least that we can do.
Dana, it's intriguing, and some people, I think, may be troubled by the fact that you present this in a racial sense. We've had a number of conversations about race and American democracy on this show. Many scholars, writers, journalists. Carol Anderson, for example, she's a very great friend of our show. She's argued, so has Andrea Young, who runs runs a civil rights group in Georgia. They've argued, or perhaps I don't want to put words into their mouth. They're not here to correct me, but they seem to give the impression that there are certain groups of Americans, particularly Black women, who get democracy better than others. Do you share their position?
Well, I don't know if I view it as certain groups more than others. Look, there have always been people who in the United States who are not necessarily on board with the democratic experiment. I don't think there are more anti-democratic people now than there were before. The problem is they're being given much more of a voice than they ever were before, and they have representation in one of our two major political parties. So I think that's the real change. You know, the I mean, black women vote in extraordinarily high numbers. White evangelical Christians vote in extraordinarily high numbers, motivated by very different reasons, but both of those has been shown by research to be in part racially driven. This was not a true democracy until the 1960s, or even after that, after the Voting Rights and Civil Rights Acts, basically made this a true democracy. And that was the beginning of the divide between the two parties along racial lines. And that was the very beginning of the backlash that Republicans have stoked over the last quarter century. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I believe, partisan politics has basically become a proxy for race. Nothing defines whether you're a Democrat or Republican more than your race and your attitude toward race. If you believe in a multicultural America, you're almost certainly going to be a Democrat. If you are concerned about a multicultural America, you are almost certainly going to be a Republican.
I don't think anyone would disagree with that, Dana. But the idea that if you're against the multicultural America as a white Republican, and as you suggest, the Republicans in your book, The Destructionists, the Republican Party has become increasingly white, that you're against democracy. I'm not sure I understand that connection. You can be against multiculturalism and for democracy, can't you?
Well, I mean, I guess you can hold those two competing ideas in your head at the same time. But if you believe in democracy, the white voters are going to become a minority. The white men have dominated this country for 250 years, longer than that if you go into our colonial heritage. That is not going to be the case. It is increasingly not the case now, and it is certainly not going to be the case 25 and 50 years from now. So you can certainly you can support democracy, but if you're concerned about this country becoming a multicultural majority and a white minority, yes, those two things are very much at odds with each other.
But what about the idea of new kinds of alliance? Politics is always about new kinds of alliances. The Hispanic community, for example, in America, seems at least more open to the Republican Party. Why shouldn't we see in the future new kinds of cultural and even racial alliances between different groups? Why does being a white man in the Republican Party, by definition, make you against democracy?
Well, it doesn't need to, and I think that would be great news if the Republican Party were competing more for Latino voters. It as recently as the George W. Bush administration, that's exactly what the Republican Party was doing when the Republican Party had its famous autopsy after Mitt Romney's defeat in 2012. It said we need to be a party that reaches out to Black Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, gay Americans, then took a decided turn against that. Look, I think it would be a wonderful solution if there were the de-racialization of politics. There have been changes at the margins of how Latinos, particularly Hispanic men, vote in elections. So there are theoretical changes that way. If you are identified as a party of white nationalism, ultimately, that's not also going to be a party of Latinos. If the Republican Party is going to change to embrace Latino voters, well, that by itself begins to erase the threat to democracy right there. what we're seeing right now in terms of the threat to democracy is attempts to enshrine minority rule. You see it in the gerrymandering. You've seen it in any number of voter suppression, blessed by the Supreme Court, which has gutted the Voting Rights Act. And you see it. I mean, it occurs in natural ways as well. In the the United States Senate just happens to be structured in a way by the founders that it empowers rural states far more than it does urban states. That nobody did that intentionally to be a disadvantage to non-white Americans. It just turns out to be that way. But look, I think there is a scenario under which the Republican Party returns to what it pledged to do in that 2012 autopsy, turns away from trying to suppress the vote of people of color and maximize the vote of white evangelical Christians and non-college educated white men. That would be a wonderful outcome.
We have also had Catherine Stewart, an expert on white American evangelicals, on the show. How central a role do you think these white evangelicals have now within the Republican Party, and how responsible are they for this crisis of democracy, both broadly in America and in terms of the Republican Party itself?
Well, so I mean, I don't have the figures in front of me, so I may be slightly off on this, but white evangelical Protestants are about 15% of the country, but 25% of the electorate. And of Trump voters, they were 40%. So it's a huge source of Donald Trump's support. There wouldn't have been a Trump presidency without the white evangelical voters. And there are a lot of this is not my field of expertise, but there's a lot of research in the area that that indicates there is a racial component to that, even more than issues like abortion or cultural issues that you would think would be the ones dominating for white evangelical Protestants and conservative Catholics. So that's Donald Trump and Republicans before that recognized that white Americans may be a shrinking share of the electorate, but if they vote in enormously high numbers, if they turn out in extraordinary numbers, well, that's still a winning coalition in today's America and will be for some years to come. And they have been turning out to vote in large number, I argue, because they've been frightened into thinking they're losing their country, that they are under siege, that they're being invaded by immigrants, and that they're losing their country. It's the sort of thing that would drive you to desperation and to fear and to rage, and those things have many negative consequences, but it does increase voter turnout.
I was going to call you Newt, Dana, but that would have been a horrible Freudian error there. Dana, your book, The Destructionists, the 25-year crack-up of the Republican Party, begins the contemporary history of the Republicans, who you call the Destructionists, with Newt Gingrich, who some people probably would argue was a racist, certainly guilty of all sorts of dog whistling. But my pushback on that is that he certainly didn't invent the dog whistle. Nixon and Reagan used it as much, and there were many Americans, both within the Republican and the Democratic Party, historically have been guilty of racism.
Absolutely, yeah.
My question to you is, can you have a democracy where there are some people in the parliament, in power, who are racists, who don't particularly like people of other skin? Is that by definition a problem for democracy?
Well, I mean, I suppose we can argue that it's not good for your culture and your society, but I
Yeah.
mean I don't see why it would by definition mean that your democracy can't work. The fundamental change that look, the before the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and when he signed it, Lyndon Johnson said, "There goes the South."
And he was right, right?
He was absolutely right. But before that, the parties weren't so homogenous. There were there were racial progressives and regressives in both parties. This realigned things fundamentally. That's what's gotten us into this very dangerous combustible place, because the parties have realigned and redefined themselves along racial lines, rather than there being, I mean, you often hear Republicans saying that, Democrats were the party of the KKK and all that, which is entirely true, but also entirely irrelevant to the current to the current discussion, any more than saying the Republican Party is the party of Lincoln, because that all changed in the mid 1960s, and that change was essentially complete when I start my book in 1994, 1995.
But Dana, are you implying that the America of Reagan and Nixon was a healthier democracy, a healthier democratic culture and political system back then?
Well, not necessarily. I want to be careful in saying that, we have this tendency to think that our moment in history is the biggest or the worst or whatever else it is. And of course, I mean, we've had many times of upheaval when the fate of our country was in doubt. Yes, of course, in the run up to the Civil War, but in the earliest decades of the country. And as we were remarking just a moment earlier, this wasn't really a true democracy at all before the 1960s. It was a democracy dominated by white people, and particularly by white men. So I don't want to suggest that there was an earlier time, halcyon days of that we had some Athenian democracy, which of course Athenian democracy perhaps wasn't an actual democracy either. So no, I don't mean to suggest that, but certainly in other ways, our democracy of the 1970s, 1980s, and the early 1990s, it was a much more functional. Our government functioned a great deal better. We were able to deal with some of our big problems in a way that we cannot deal with now. I mean, there was the winning of the Cold War, and the years that built this country's power that is now receding.
Then are there models, either in historical terms or of other countries, that America should want to emulate as it refines or saves its democracy in the first half of the 21st century? If I was talking to Hillary Clinton, she might point to Denmark.
I'm sure we can draw lessons from any number of countries on discrete elements of reforms and how we could do things differently. But I'm a believer in American exceptionalism, and that's in a patriotic sense, but also in the sense that America is just different from other countries. So no, I don't think we can, and no country has been at this point, at this point in world history. So I don't think there's anything analogous that we can say, well, they've got it right, and we've got it wrong. I mean, many of the problems that you and I are discussing right now are happening in Europe, happening around the world, and in some places I'd argue that it may well be worse than what we're seeing here. So in a sense, there are any number. We know what the reforms could be done to make it easier to vote, to get the the cancerous element of unregulated dark money out of politics. We know what could be done to rebuild local media, to get rid of the more pernicious effects of social media, the polarizing effects of the media, change the structure of the parties, change the primary system, change districting. All of these things could be done and all would improve our democracy and alleviate the problem. But not one of them can be done unless you have two functioning, healthy political parties that are trying to preserve democracy. And I just don't, it doesn't look to me like we have two of those right now.
Dana, you've made race and perhaps racism the heart of the struggle to save American democracy. What about the role of education in fighting the idea of race and racism in schools? Education is such a hot political potato these days. Ron DeSantis may indeed run on it in 2024. How important is it to confront race and racism, or the issue of race and racism centrally, if we're to save American democracy?
Well, I don't think they're two separate issues when you talk about education and you talk about racism. I mean, they're both, front and center part of the culture wars right now, and the fights over education, critical race theory and invented phantom menace that Ron DeSantis is chasing is all about race. The laws and changes that are being put into place is saying you can't discuss certain elements of our history, memory laws essentially, and bans on critical race theory, bans in Florida even on certain math textbooks. But there's definitely a racial component to that. But it goes beyond race. We're obviously having similar fights over sexuality, sex education. The schools have just become another battleground in the culture war. So I think that's really reflecting. But yeah, when we're talking about what would be the solutions if we had two parties that were good faith participants in a democracy, yes, we'd be talking about civics education and national service and any number of other things that could restore what we've lost in America.
What's the role of economics, Dana, in all this? Is the quote-unquote racism of many white Republicans, is it a defensive, paranoid response to their increasing marginalization in economic terms? Or are they biological racists who simply believe that white people are superior to blacks?
To say they obviously oversimplifies. Yes, there are people of all the descriptions that you just said. But when I say people are, the parties are divided more by race or motivated by race, I don't mean to be suggesting that all Republicans are running around wearing bed sheets and burning crosses. It's not. It's nothing like that at all. It's questions can be asked on. As they often are on national surveys. Do you, for example, do you feel if black people just worked harder, they could get ahead? So, those are questions of racial bias, racial animus. So, and if somebody says yes to that question, they would certainly say, well, I'm not a racist, but you would be racially motivated. So this is not suggesting that this is a country of Klansmen. That's an entirely different thing. We've also seen, when Trump came to power, there was an argument that this was really about economic grievance. But this has been teased out in any number of ways. This has been studied and studied in the political scientists, and you really see that there's a great deal of evidence that it's not primarily economic concerns that's driving this backlash. They certainly contribute. They're certainly there. It is by and large overwhelmingly a racial backlash. So yes, the two things can exist at the same time. And even the racial part of the backlash does not mean you have, a bunch of people running around using the N word. It's not, it's a little subtler than that.
There'll be some people watching this, Dana, who will be thinking maybe he's right, that the problem is just as bad on the other side with quote unquote critical race theory, whether that's real or not. There are certainly many people who believe on the progressive side that everything needs to be thought of in racial terms. Mm-hmm. Does the Democratic Party, and particularly on the left of the Democratic Party, do they need to clean up their act in terms of preserving democracy too, so that we can reach this promised land of 2045?
Yeah, look, I think where the left in America has been going with what's can be called woke politics, for lack of a better explanation, but sort of supercharged identity politics. I think that's very harmful. Not necessarily harmful in and of itself, but because it is distracting from larger issues and larger threats like this sort of existential threat to democracy. So I think that is a concern. Is it a symmetrical concern? I think we need to be careful of drawing a false equivalence. There is a raging fire on the right in terms of a threat to democracy, and there is a little bit of a contained brush fire on the left right now. So I just don't see the two things as parallel, but I do agree that there are tendencies on the left that need to be addressed. The woke politics is not taking us in the right direction. Look, if you look at all the things that I write about in the book, conspiracy theories, disinformation, violence, extremism. It's not as if the right has a monopoly on these things. I mean, people by their nature, there's conspiracy theorists on the right and left. There's not necessarily more on one side than the other. The difference is they've been given a platform on the right, and they've been admitted into the tent, and in many cases they are in fact the political leaders right now.
Talking of political leaders, Dana, are you concerned about the quality of leadership, particularly on the left? I mean, clearly there are leaders on the right like DeSantis and Trump. We may not like them, but they're skilled demagogues of one kind or another. Why have progressives struggled to get beyond Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi? Where are the young people on the left who can really revitalize American democracy?
Yeah, I have written about this. I would like to see younger people and fresher faces in there. I do think that in a way it's I keep coming back to the asymmetry here. I don't think even if you had somebody Pete Buttigieg or somebody young and articulate and charismatic. It's not a fair fight when you're going up against a demagogue. The Democrats, they deserve all kinds of criticism over the years for not being tough enough in the fight, for all their squabbles among themselves. We have one side in our political system that is not playing by the rules here. So the Democrats could answer that with their own conspiracy theories, with their own stoking of violence and race, with their own use of disinformation. But if they were to do that and win with it, it would only accelerate the demise of the country. So, Democrats are in a way, fighting with a hand tied behind their back, but that's the sort of the nature of this fight.
What do you most fear, Dana, about the future of American democracy? I understand that we need to get to 2045 or the middle part of the 21st century, where perhaps things will get realigned in cultural or racial terms. Are you more fearful of civil war, or are you more fearful of a sort of a degeneracy into January 6th style coup d'etats?
Much more the latter, although I'm not sure that I see a huge distinction there, because we don't when we talk about civil war in this country, we're not talking about, armies lining up and firing bullets at each other. We're talking about, episodes of political violence, which we're seeing already. What I'm concerned about is that a generation of Americans or more may be sort of losing, the democratic muscle memory, or whatever it is, that the notion that these are our traditions, that these are worth preserving. These things aren't lost in one election cycle or in two election cycles. So I'm not worried that we're suddenly in some big shooting civil war. I'm not worried that we're going to have some authoritarian fascist takeover. I'm worried about a gradual slide into both of those things. The sort of creeping authoritarianism, creeping violence. That's what we have to be on guard for. I think these things will fade from us gradually.
And what do we need to most protect then to avoid that creeping authoritarianism? Is it our legal system? Is it our electoral system? Is it free newspapers?
Yeah, it's all of these things. I mean, it's the our First Amendment rights. It's protecting the franchise and the vote above all else. Yes, it's the rule of law and the courts. It's also our federal system, so that the states have been a bulwark against the power of the federal government, sometimes for bad, and at this moment it's been a stabilizing force. So I don't think it's a ranked priority. I think small d Democrats need to be devoting themselves to all of these things.
Which do you think, though, is the most vulnerable?
I see them all being eroded in a very similar way. I mean, it's I see I'm very close to the press. I'm part of the press, so I see the damage of being, called the enemy of the people, and, losing the ability to speak to Americans as opposed to partisans of one side or the other. I mean, looking at the threats to the rule of law that we've seen this year are horrifying. Looking at the slate of candidates who deny that the outcome of the last election and are trying to arrange it so that states are effectively clear to reject the popular vote in future elections. I mean, it's like, how can you rank one of those poisons above the others? Each one of them is lethal.
Well, let's end, Dana, in the short term rather than the long term, because at least we on How to Fix Democracy can't really wait until 2045. If we're going to strengthen American democracy, we need to do it in the next few years. Where does the focus need to be over the next, say, 5 years in terms of defending American democracy, its institutions and ideas? Where would you begin concretely?
Well, I would mobilization is the key to all of this. That is getting small d Democrats out there volunteering. Yes, of course, voting, going to the polls, heading into government, into careers in the civil service, running for office. I'm not suggesting that what I do is a public service, but engaging in careers in journalism, advocacy groups, the law. I mean, they're all the same ways you could express your love of country before. This is the time to be doing it. So whether you need to be going to swing states and driving people to the polls where where they've not made that illegal, or bringing them bottles of water if they've not made that illegal. But you know what I mean. I don't think there's one magic bullet. I think it just needs to be a massive amount of civic engagement.
And if the Republican Party continues to crack up and destroy more and more, you called them the Destructionists, do we need to think about some sort of constitutional approach to the Republicans themselves, if they themselves are against the Constitution, against American democracy?
Well, there's no practical way to do that. So I don't believe in changing the rules because one side is not operating by the rules. Look, there's the often unspoken possibility out there is that things accelerate and we reach something that is like Oklahoma City in 1995, only much larger. Could there be, God forbid, some cataclysmic event that causes us to recoil in horror and say, wait a second, we got to put things back on the right track. I certainly don't want such a thing to happen. I do want us to get to a point where we pull back. And I don't know, short of some catastrophic event, what brings that about in the near term.
I don't want to end too miserably, Dana. So what would be the opposite of an Oklahoma-style bombing? Would it be the election of a new Barack Obama? Is there a singular equivalent for optimists of the Oklahoma bombing?
Sure. I mean, there's an argument to be made that there are there are an awful lot of elected Republicans who have gone along with Trumpism just simply out of fear of Trump, that he will be gone, and somebody like Ron DeSantis replaces him, and then brings us back more within the bounds of the rule of law and away from the racial and cultural wars, which leads us to rely on this notion that Ron DeSantis and all the other Republican leaders right now are essentially faking it. So I don't believe that's where we're headed. But there is a potential scenario there in which that Trump disappears and the Republicans say, right, that didn't go so well. We're going to get back on course to where we were after 2012 and the autopsy. So that's a counter argument, but it's a much happier one. I wish I could believe that.
Well, you've half convinced me, Dana. Thank you so much for trying to be cheerful.
All right.
We love your book. We love your columns on how to fix democracy. Keep up the good work.
Thank you. You too.